Hi, this is Steve Schragi, and today I will be talking about podcasts and digital stories. The digital story that I will be talking about today is called What the Water Gave Me, Maya's Story. I chose this digital story because the pictures and the story were very moving. The content in it really tugged at your heartstrings. But what really caught my attention is that this could happen in any town, anywhere in the USA. The theme of this story is how some Tucson, Arizona residents lived a life of pain and suffering. A chemical called TCE was dumped on the south side of Tucson for many years. Some of the residents became sick and died from the TCE pollution in their drinking water. I am very passionate that every American has clean drinking water and not to be exposed to harmful pollution in their everyday life. Pollution such as this should never happen in America, and instances like this should be brought to light so that it will never happen again. As of recently, podcasts have become ever more popular, and I decided to jump on the podcast bandwagon. I have an hour and a half drive to work and back. So as of recently, I've been listening to different podcasts. And I have found that the Joe Rogan Experience podcast to be one of my favorites. The Joe Rogan Experience is probably one of the most popular podcasts out there right now. Last week, Joe Rogan had conspiracy theorist Alex Jones on his podcast. I was not familiar with Alex before this podcast and didn't know what to expect, but I listened to it anyways. I guess I would summarize the overall theme and message of the podcast to be there are a lot of bad things and conspiracies happening that we are unaware of. A lot of the content that Alex said made no sense, but some things sparked an interest. And I decided to do some research of my own on some of the topics. One of the topics of discussion was the effects of 5G cellular technology on the human body. As discussed earlier, I am very passionate about being able to live out every day without the possibility of being subjected to pollution or something that will harm you. Well, I will be discussing some of my findings later in this presentation. But to get back on track now, I really believe that this podcast was effective because Joe Rogan and Alex Jones didn't script any of the topics that they discussed. They just spoke what they were thinking, and you could see how sincere both of them were throughout the podcast. I really enjoyed the non-scripted speaking from the heart part about the podcast, and I am going to attempt to do that in my next segment here. As technologies evolve, when are we ever satisfied? Should we be rushing to get new technology out at such a furious pace that we don't stop and think, should we even be doing this? When has the idea of turning a profit become more important than the safety of its users? In today's topic, I will be discussing the dangers of the new 5G cellular technology. The 5G is much different than the existing 4G. The 4G runs at a low frequency, wide bandwidth. It's at about 2 to 8 gigahertz and has a max range of about 22 miles. While the 5G runs on an extremely high frequency, short bandwidth at a range of 30 to 360 gigahertz. But this only has a max distance of several hundred feet. The 5G runs on millimeter waves that are so powerful that it will excite and turn on microchips in electronics and transmit back and forth without having any power even hooked up. What the 5G is lacking in max range, it has to make up for in power. So it is at a much higher power than the 4G is. What's interesting is that the spectrum of millimeter wavelengths hasn't been used for this purpose before. During a recent Congress hearing, the cellular industry claims that they have spent $0 on research of studying the effects of 5G on human bodies. Our body, our DNA, is a receiver and transmitter of information. There have been some independent studies done that claim that using millimeter wavelengths for the use of cellular communication can lead to broken single and double DNA strands. This is very concerning, and before we rush into getting this 5G technology in place, we should really stop and do more research on the subject. Some of the other studies have shown that our body's sweat ducts act as antennas, and the sweat ducts will absorb about 90% of the energy transmitted in the 5G wavelength. That's pretty scary. There are some weapons out there used for crowd control and such that the government has, where they fire this wavelength, and when that touches your skin, it feels like it's burning, and you run away because you actually feel like you're on fire. And that is the sweat ducts acting as antenna, absorbing the energy. And the 5G is very similar to some of those weapons, but it's just at a lower power scale. It's kind of scary that the same technology that's used in crowd control weapons we're looking to implement as everyday use in cellular phones. Think about this. Your brain fires synapses that send signals to different parts of the body. Those synapses are at a similar frequency as the 5G waves, the millimeter wavelengths. So there's a distinct possibility that the 5G could disrupt your brain activity. Or maybe at some point in the future could even be used for maybe some form of mind control. So kind of to wrap all this up, between the lack of research that has been done, the technology itself being so similar to crowd control weapons, and being fired at wavelengths that are similar to many of the wavelengths in the human body, having this short range where you have to have very powerful signals sent, all is a recipe for disaster. And I really think that we should stop and find out what 5G will really do to humans before we fully implement it across the United States. Thank you for your time, and have a great day.